Hello, people. Working outside, so I'm growing a beard. How does it look? Makes me look like a fucking old man. That's how it looks. I finished a book. Grant Moves South. It's part one of the classic Civil War study of General Ulysses S. Grant. I've since started another book, and then I looked on the shelf again, and I actually have part two. So I'll do part two after the next book. Today's Sunday. I finished this book on Friday. I read it pretty quick. It was 489 pages. I've been pretty broke these last couple of months, so I have not gone out and bought new books. I have a whole bunch of Civil War books. That's what my dad was reading towards the end of his life, and so I've got a whole bunch of Civil War books in there. And so far, with as much reading as I've done about the 19th century, I've kind of tiptoed around the American Civil War. I don't really, the more I read here, the more I find out that I don't know shit about it. I mean, I know little bits about it. Everybody knows about Gettysburg, and, I know some very basic facts, but I'm finding out that there's a lot more to it, and there's a whole shitload that I don't know. So this was a very good book. It's written by Bruce Catton or Catton. The one I'm reading now is also by the same guy. Part two, obviously, is by the same guy. So I have a few books written by the same author, which is kind of nice. There was parts of this book that were a little bit boring. My first note says page 76 before there's any fighting. The 7th Iowa. Now I gotta fucking find that. The 7th Iowa ran into a headlong rebel charge, and Illinois soldiers who watched said that the regiment swung back like the opening of a double gate. But the repulse was only temporary. The Iowans reformed and went forward again, and other regiments plowed on ahead, and in a short time Grant's men were driving everything before them. Woods and cornfields were cleared, and before noon the advancing Federals reached the Confederate camp, which was enclosed by low earthworks. Pillow's men were badly scattered by now, and suddenly all resistance ceased. Pillow is another name from the Mexican-American War. Disorganized Confederates ran to the river and huddled behind the low banks for protection, while jubilant Northerners were romping through the captured camp, seized some cannon, began to pick up old abandoned odds and ends of rebel property, and then, cheering and dancing with joy, got completely out of hand and entered into a premature and wholly disorganized celebration of their victory. They got out of hand, yeah, and they ended up getting counterattacked and getting kind of fucked up. Parts of the book are about, supply corruption, people, just fucking getting as much money as they can for shoddy goods, political backstabbing, a lot like the Mexican-American War. Irregulars caused trouble for the North and South. Cavalry raids and guerrilla warfare. I'll go a long ways here without another note. The first big battle here in this is Shiloh. And Shiloh was really just a massed Confederate attack on some unprepared Union troops. They don't call them Union in the books, they call them Federal. The Federal troops just were not ready for this. They didn't, they had pickets out and everything like that, but they didn't have any trenches dug or anything like that. And there was just a massive attack. And my note here says even a Roman legion would entrench their camp every night. They didn't do it. But Grant reacts as well as he could. Grant was about 3-4 miles away at his headquarters. He heard the attack beginning. He immediately went to the front, and the first thing he did, since, incredibly, the Federal Army his troops had 6 different caliber weapons there. The first thing he did was organize ammunition going to the front. A lot of this book is about what happens to runaway slaves. And at first Grant turns them away, uh, but how they deal with runaway slaves kind of evolves through the book, and Union soldiers, their attitudes towards the whole issue of slavery and to runaway slaves. They don't call them runaway slaves in here; they call them contrabands. The, the whole attitude of the North changes. The war did not start about slavery, but it slowly became about slavery. One of the things I like about this author is he uses stories. He uses a whole lot of first-hand accounts, and he uses storytelling. Man, that's the best way to write a book, because I never forget these cool little stories. You might think that my note here says no broad overview but piecemeal. You might think that I should probably get a book and like the Civil War and read that book first. No, you're not going to learn shit from a book like that. You have to take things piecemeal, and if one book is just about Shiloh, then that's fine. Uh, there is a lot of politics in this war. The politicians are they have their favorite generals. They have generals they hate. People will make up lies about the generals that they hate. A lot of what we think about Grant, Grant, right away you think Grant was a drinker. But he certainly wasn't an alcoholic, because I have only seen in this whole book a couple of times where he takes a drink. I never saw where he was drunk. But apparently there's something that happened in California. It sounds like it was at the tail end of the Mexican-American War. Something happens in California where Grant he's just a captain. Something happens that is a big disgrace for him. But Lincoln actually sent a spy just to watch Grant. There's some kind of funny stuff to it. Hopefully I marked that funny thing. The spy that he sends to watch Grant's behavior just ends up idolizing Grant. And then it says, second paragraph. I don't know. I'm not going to read that. Bottom of page 396, top of page 397. It was just a little later this spring that Chaplain Eaton, who had all of those darkies on his shoulder, went to Washington to report to the president on the work he was doing. He found that Lincoln had come to his own conclusion. Lincoln told him how a delegation of congressmen had come to the White House to urge Grant's removal on the ground that he drank too much. As Eaton remembered the conversation, Lincoln said, "I then began to ask them if they knew what he drank, what brand of whiskey he used, telling them most seriously that I wished they would find out. They conferred with each other and concluded that they could not tell what brand he used. I urged them to ascertain and let me know. For if it made fighting generals like Grant, I should like to get some of it for distribution." And this guy Eaton, that line, all of those darkies on his shoulder. Eaton he was like a divisional chaplain, and Grant just pulls him out of line and says, "You know what? You're going to be in charge of making camps for all these black people that we're getting, all these runaway slaves. You're going to be in charge of sending them north. You're going to be in charge of setting up the camps for them there." There was a whole lot to do. You couldn't just set them on the road. They would starve to death. They didn't have clothing. They didn't have food. So Grant slowly put people in charge of it. And, of course, Grant wasn't the only one working on that. It was an entire evolution of how they were going to handle that. The book ends with the siege of Vicksburg. And, of course, there's nothing like a good siege, man. They could write an entire book about that siege of Vicksburg. But that was one of the first big victories for the Federals. Grant took 30,000 prisoners at Vicksburg, and he decides to parole these prisoners, which is something that they did. I mean, they did that during the Napoleonic Wars, and and people respected their paroles, and they would not fight again until what would happen is, you know, the if you were paroled, you didn't go home. You went back. You stayed in your own territory. You went back, and there was a camp for you. You had to stay in uniform. The South had to pay to feed these guys and clothe them, and the upkeep of the camp. If Grant would have taken these guys prisoner, he would have lost days and days and days with transport trying to send them north, and wagons and paddle wheelers, everything. I don't know. I've always thought that the parole thing was kind of cool. They did that in Europe a lot, and that's what they did here at the end of the book. The book ends with Vicksburg. So there's a whole lot more to go. The book that I'm reading now is not so much about Grant. It's about McClellan, and I'll be making that video probably in 2 days because I'm really flying through this book. So, thank you for watching.